The night was supposed to be like any other, but for Aiko Tanaka, it became the last night of her life. As she sat in her quiet apartment, studying for her future, she never imagined the man she trusted most would be the one to destroy everything. Haruto, her boyfriend of a year, seemed perfect until the darkness inside him was unleashed. What began as a quiet argument turned into a nightmare of manipulation, control, and violence. By dawn, Aiko's world had shattered, and she was left fighting for her life in the very place she had once felt safe. But the horrors she faced that night were just the beginning. The truth of what happened behind those walls would reveal a betrayal so deep, it would haunt everyone who knew her. What could drive someone to take everything from the person they loved most? The answer is far more terrifying than anyone could ever imagine. The night began like any other, calm and uneventful, in the small, peaceful town where 20-year-old Aiko Tanaka lived. Aiko, a dedicated university student, had spent the day buried in her textbooks, preparing for an important exam. Her dream was clear. She wanted to succeed, to make her family proud, and to build a life filled with purpose. Haruto, her boyfriend of a year, had always been supportive, or at least she thought. They were inseparable in public, always the picture-perfect couple, admired by friends and family alike. But tonight, something felt off. Aiko couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that a storm was quietly building on the horizon. The apartment was quiet, the kind of silence that would normally be comforting, but tonight, it pressed in on her, suffocating. Haruto had been acting distant for weeks, leaving her confused and unsure of their relationship. It wasn't like him. They had shared so many quiet moments, studying together, laughing over dinner, but now there was an unease in the air. Aiko tried to brush it off as stress from her studies, but a nagging voice in her mind wouldn't let her. As she sat on the couch, sorting through her notes, she felt a chill creeping over her. The soft sound of Haruto's footsteps broke the silence, but they weren't the gentle steps she was used to. They were heavy, deliberate, as if he were walking with a purpose. She glanced up, startled, and caught his gaze. His eyes were cold, unblinking, something unfamiliar in them. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but said nothing, unwilling to confront what she feared was brewing. When Haruto spoke, his voice was laced with tension, a sharp edge she hadn't heard before. "We need to talk," he said, and in that moment, Aiko felt the ground shift beneath her. The warmth she had once felt for him began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of dread. Something had changed in him, something dark, and she had no idea how far he was willing to go. As Haruto's words hung in the air, Aiko's heart raced, and the once safe apartment now felt like a prison. She didn't know it yet, but that night would end in a way that would forever alter the course of her life. The person she had trusted most would betray her in ways she couldn't yet comprehend, and nothing would ever be the same. As the evening wore on, the tension in the air grew unbearable. Aiko tried to keep her composure, forcing herself to smile as Haruto sat beside her, his cold silence making her stomach churn. The conversation they had started earlier seemed to hang over them, heavy and unspoken. She asked him what was wrong, but his response was distant, like he was withholding something that didn't belong in the quiet apartment they once shared. Aiko's thoughts raced. Was it her? Was it something she had done? She couldn't pinpoint the cause, but there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere, and it terrified her. Every time she tried to reason with him, Haruto's eyes grew darker, his voice colder. There was a sharpness in the way he spoke, a kind of anger simmering just beneath the surface. Aiko's attempts to calm him down only seemed to stoke the fire. She asked if he was upset about something, anything, but his answers were clipped, dismissive. It was as if he was purposefully pushing her away. And then, it happened. Without warning, the words he had been holding back spilled out in a burst of rage. Haruto accused her of being distant, of not caring about their relationship, of focusing too much on her studies. Aiko was stunned. Where had this come from? She had always tried to balance everything, her dreams and her love for him. But tonight, something inside Haruto seemed to snap. The quiet moments of affection they once shared felt like a distant memory. In an instant, Haruto's anger escalated into something physical. The slap was so fast, so jarring, Aiko barely had time to react. Her cheek stung and her heart raced as she touched her face in disbelief. How could he? The person she trusted most had just struck her, and for what? She didn't know. Her body trembled with fear, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Where would she go? And would it make a difference? Aiko tried to speak, to reason with him again, but Haruto wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were wild, his voice shaking with fury. She pleaded for him to stop, to calm down, but the more she begged, the more his rage consumed him. She realized with chilling clarity that she was no longer speaking to the man she loved. She was speaking to a stranger, a dangerous one. The apartment that had once felt like a safe haven now felt like a trap. And no matter how hard Aiko tried to escape, Haruto's grip on her tightened. As the night dragged on, Aiko felt the weight of fear settle over her like a thick blanket. The pain from the slap lingered on her cheek, a constant reminder of the twisted turn their evening had taken. She could barely recognize Haruto anymore, his eyes cold and emotionless as he towered over her. Her body ached, but it was the sinking feeling in her chest that hurt the most. The man she had once trusted, the man who had been gentle and loving, was now a stranger, capable of unimaginable cruelty. Desperately, Aiko searched for a way out, but the apartment felt smaller with each passing moment. Every corner seemed to close in on her as Haruto loomed nearby, muttering in anger. She tried to stand, but her legs felt weak, her limbs betraying her as if they, too, had given up. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't understand. Why are you doing this?" But Haruto's response was a growl, his words laced with venom. "You never understood. You think you're too good for me. You think your dreams are more important than us." His voice was rising, each word striking like a blow. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. This was no longer just an argument. It was a battle for control, and she was losing. He was out of control, driven by some twisted need to dominate, to break her down. When she tried to move toward the door, her heart racing, Haruto was faster. He blocked her path, his face twisted with a fury she had never seen before. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she realized she was trapped. He was holding her prisoner in her own home. Panic surged through her veins, but she forced herself to stay calm, hoping that if she could just get him to listen, this nightmare would end. "I love you," she said, her voice desperate, her eyes pleading for him to see reason. But Haruto's expression never changed. The words meant nothing to him. Slowly, methodically, he pushed her back onto the floor, his hands gripping her shoulders with force. Aiko's breath caught in her throat. The world around her started to blur as tears streamed down her face, the pain from the night overwhelming her. She felt herself losing consciousness, the last shred of hope slipping through her fingers as she realized that there was no escape. The person she loved had turned into her worst nightmare, and she had no idea how to survive this. When Aiko's roommate arrived at the apartment the next morning, she immediately sensed something was wrong. The silence was unsettling, the kind of silence that feels too heavy, too thick to be natural. As she stepped into the hallway, she noticed the door was slightly ajar, the apartment dark and cold. Her heart began to race as she called out for Aiko, her voice trembling with unease. No response. Panic crept in as she pushed the door open fully, stepping into the living room. The sight before her froze her in place. Aiko's lifeless body lay motionless on the floor, pale and still, her face bruised and battered from the night's violence. The room was a mess. Overturned furniture, scattered papers, the unmistakable signs of a struggle. The air in the apartment felt thick with the remnants of fear, of desperation. Her roommate's breath caught in her throat as she dropped to her knees beside Aiko, her hands shaking as she tried to rouse her friend. There was no response, only the chilling realization that Aiko was gone. Despair quickly turned to dread. What had happened here? How had this all unfolded? The police arrived soon after, and the grim discovery of Aiko's body sent shockwaves through the small town. The questions began to surface immediately. Was it an accident? Was it suicide? Or was it something darker? The police scoured the apartment, examining every inch for clues, while their minds began to piece together the tragic story that had unfolded in the dead of night. There were signs of struggle, a broken lamp and bloodstains on the floor. But there was one detail that made the detectives' blood run cold. The apartment had been locked from the inside, and Haruto was nowhere to be found. The more the authorities dug, the more unsettling the picture became. Aiko's phone, still resting on the coffee table, was locked. There were no messages, no calls, nothing to indicate any warning signs. Her friends had noticed her being distant lately, but nothing had seemed amiss until now. And then a chilling detail emerged. Haruto had left the apartment in the early hours of the morning, but no one had seen him since. The investigation had only just begun, but one thing was clear. Aiko's death wasn't an accident. It was murder, and Haruto was the prime suspect. But where was he? What had driven him to this point? The haunting silence of the apartment left everyone with more questions than answers, and the story was only just beginning to unfold. As the investigation into Aiko's death progressed, chilling details began to surface about Haruto's past and his increasingly troubling behavior. The detectives uncovered disturbing messages between him and Aiko, their tone growing more controlling and possessive as the weeks passed. It became clear that Haruto had been spiraling into a dark obsession with her, his jealousy over her success at university and growing independence turning into resentment. The texts were a revelation. He had been trying to isolate Aiko from her friends and family, subtly undermining her confidence and making her feel guilty for spending time away from him. But it wasn't just the words that were telling. It was the way Haruto had been monitoring her every move, checking her phone, tracking her social media activity, even going so far as to follow her when she left the apartment. It was clear now that Aiko had been suffocating under his control, but she had kept it hidden, trying to protect her relationship and her image of the man she once loved. The real breakthrough came when the police discovered Haruto's digital trail. Hidden in his online accounts were disturbing searches, plans for the night of Aiko's death. It became apparent that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime. Haruto had been planning it for days, carefully crafting the moments that would lead to Aiko's demise. He had researched methods of making her feel trapped, of breaking her spirit completely before delivering the final blow. The most chilling piece of evidence was a confession he had written in a private journal, detailing his growing obsession with her and his belief that if he couldn't have her, no one else could. The detectives were horrified by the calculated nature of his actions, how he had planned everything, right down to the moment he would strike. But even with all this evidence, Haruto remained elusive. He had disappeared without a trace, leaving only the haunting remnants of his betrayal. Weeks passed, and the case seemed to stall. But then a breakthrough came, a sighting of Haruto in a neighboring town. The man who had been hiding in plain sight was finally caught, arrested, and brought back to face justice. As he sat in the interrogation room, his cold demeanor and lack of remorse shocked everyone involved. The man who had once been so charming had become a monster, and now Aiko's tragic fate would be revealed to the world. The truth was devastating. Aiko's death had never been an accident, nor had it been a spur-of-the-moment act of violence. It had been premeditated, driven by control, jealousy, and an unrelenting desire to break her spirit. In the end, it wasn't just Aiko's life that had been shattered. It was the life they had once shared, a life built on lies and betrayal. In the end, Haruto's trial brought the truth to light, but it did nothing to ease the pain felt by those who had loved Aiko. Her family, her friends, and even those who had seen her from a distance struggled to comprehend the depth of betrayal she had endured in the final days of her life. The person she had trusted, the one who had promised to stand by her, had taken everything from her in an act of jealousy and control. The courtroom was filled with a quiet tension as the prosecutor laid out the evidence of Haruto's premeditated actions. The chilling details of his manipulation, the messages that proved he had been grooming her for his twisted plan, and the heartbreaking realization that Aiko had been suffering alone, all struck a devastating blow to everyone present. Haruto's lack of remorse was even more haunting. His cold, emotionless demeanor as he sat there, hearing about the life he had taken, only confirmed what had been feared all along. Aiko had been nothing more than a possession to him. The defense tried to argue that his actions were a result of emotional turmoil, but no one was buying it. The calculated steps he had taken, the brutal violence he had inflicted, left no room for sympathy. When the verdict was finally read, guilty of murder in the first degree, there was no celebration, no sense of victory. Aiko's life could never be returned, and her loved ones were left to piece together the shattered remnants of the bright, ambitious young woman she had been. Haruto was sentenced to life in prison, but even the finality of that sentence couldn't erase the horror of what had happened. The tragedy of Aiko Tanaka would forever haunt those who knew her, a heartbreaking reminder of how love, when twisted, can become a weapon capable of destroying everything in its path. As the years passed, the memory of Aiko's smile, her dreams, and her aspirations lingered in the hearts of those who loved her. Though her life was stolen in the most brutal way, the truth of her story, of her strength and the love she had fought to preserve, would live on.